All right, folks, welcome to some more sociology for you. Today I'm going to be talking about the internet and the web and smartphones. And I have had an interest in the internet for a while, but more recently smartphones and the impact of smartphones in society. And to kind of start out talking about this, we've mentioned this in class about sociocultural evolution. And look down there at the very bottom where it says, let me find it right here, where it says digital dualism, okay? I've suggested to you that we've entered into a new stage of cultural revolution. And that's a pretty big statement to make. And, as a reminder, this slide here is looking at social transformations of society over time and what have been some major cultural watershed events in the course of human history. And, the ones listed here are the discovery of tools or the invention of tools and technology to make growing food easier, with the agricultural revolution, basically speaking, the industrial revolution. Computers have been well documented and spoken about in terms of the overall impact on culture that it has had. And I'm suggesting to you that what we've experienced over the past 25 years or so, really in the last 15 to 20 years, have given us pause to talk about another, cultural revolution, right? And that's a pretty big statement to make. And so I want to cover some of that today. And in so doing, it's in this chapter where we start looking more at quantitative research. So going forward here, we'll be looking more at percentages and numbers and that type of research. And so what I'm going to do here in this lecture and show you here momentarily, to begin momentarily, is not just looking at internet and looking at smartphones and things like that, but also how to give you a little bit of insight as to how we do research in social sciences, in sociology in particular. So it's twofold, right? So in order for us to talk about, social transformation of Web 2.0 and this idea of digital dualism, how can we say that? I mean, where's the research on that? Okay, and so I'm going to show you that, and I think you'll find it interesting. I know a lot of people are really big into their cell phones and digital technology. I'm fascinated with it, but as I've said, I noticed some things about 10, 15 years ago, some changes in society, and so I've been tracking that, and it's become a career interest of mine. So let's look at some things here. So. Some of what we're going to look at, a lot of what we're going to look at comes from the Pew Research Center. So there are various organizations in our society. Many of them are tied to universities or academic institutions. Sometimes they're called think tanks. But there are many organizations in society that do research on a variety of topics. And the Pew Research Center has been around for quite some time. And they're one of a handful of places in the United States that has a focus on behavioral and societal changes associated with using mobile technology and the internet. And so a lot of the research that I'm going to be showing you is going to come from the Pew Research Center. So let's jump into looking at a few things. So as we get started here, you remember this, and it's something I talk about over and over and over early in the semester. When we think about society, we want to think about, not just individuals, but the institutional aspect of society and culture. Now, let me go on and say something here. In order for something to be a cultural change, it has to spread throughout society. So one thing can change, but other things don't change. So sometimes you see trends and fads. They kind of come and go, right? So, for example, TikTok might be a trend. The use of TikTok. it might be a fad. Or is it something that it becomes embedded in various aspects of society and becomes, very much a part of culture? It's a cultural change. So trends and fads can be part of cultural change, but a trend or a fad doesn't mean that everything has changed. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that the internet has been a major technological innovation that has led to cultural change. It's not just a trend or a fad, it's a part of everyday life. So, in order to be able to say that something has caused cultural change, widespread cultural change, then we should be able to look at this graph over here and say, all right, how has something impacted each of these social institutions? And so, not just within the field of the workplace, but how has it affected family relationships, or how has it affected the practice of religion, right? And so not many things have broad social impact. I mean, when we go back and look at this first slide, not the first, but this slide right here, well, I guess it was the first, this slide right here, notice there are only 4, 5, maybe 6 particular points in human history, not just in the United States, right? But in human history that have indicated large-scale social transformation. And I'm suggesting to you that we've witnessed and we're witnessing a continuing shift in our culture tied to technology, Web 2.0, mobile phones, broadband, and that type of modern technologies, okay? All right, so let's jump in and let's look at a few things. So the first thing I'm going to show you, this is a little bit difficult to see probably, all right? And that's okay. I'm going to point out a few things to you about this, all right? So what you're looking at here is the percent of U.S. adults who use the internet. So people 18 years of age and older. And so the Pew Research Center does this research annually. And this is the most recent data that they have on this particular topic, okay? What percent of adults use the internet, okay? So just let me highlight a few things to you. Back in 2000, 20 years ago, 52% of adults were using the internet. And you fast forward to this most recent data of 2019, and it's 90%. Now, that's a doubling. So, back in the year 2000, people were using it, but it was more, it was becoming very much a part of society, certainly. But, I mentioned trends, fads, and something that becomes culturally significant, in terms of everyday use. When you go from 50% to 90%, that is an indication of cultural change. Now, the question is, in the future, will 90% of people use the internet? So when you've got 90%, that's almost 100%, right? So if everybody's using the internet, what's the likelihood that, in 2, 5, even 10 years, that number will go from 100% down to 50%? It's kind of hard to undo things once you have them in place. It's kind of hard to undo things in society. So we are more and more, over those last 20 years, right? More and more we have built relationships and constructed society in many ways, with internet technology is a very important part of that, right? Now, so moving forward here, I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag on everything here. So, but the point again, one of the points about showing you that this data is giving you an idea about how we do research on human populations. Okay, and so that slide that I just showed you was the adults. Well, let's break that out. And is it the same across age groups? And this should begin to shed some light on some things here. And so the percent of U.S. adults who use the internet by age. Now, what this is that it takes a snapshot of people in a different age group over time. So you're looking at from the year 2000 on up to 2019. And the top group are those 18 to 29. The second group are 30 to 49. And the third group is 50 to 64 years of age. And this last group is 65 plus. So In the year 2000, it was 52%. Well, depending on your age group, right? If you're older, it was under 25%. If you were younger, it was almost 75% back in 2000. So why is it that younger people over time were more likely to use the internet? Well, that's an interesting thing to think about. And this is, why it's important, to keep asking questions and to keep doing the research. We're digging deeper and deeper into this idea of internet use. Now, let me draw a very important part here. Sometimes you'll see young people are more likely to do something and older people are less likely or more likely. Sometimes things in society, human behavior, varies according to age, right? So, for example, we know that older people are more likely to vote than younger people. Well, why is that the case? We know that older people, let's say, those that are 35 to 55 are more likely to be working full time than people that are 25 and younger. Well, why is that the case? Well, one reason, younger people are more likely to be in school, right? It's harder for younger people to get full-time jobs because they don't have the work experience. So there's all kinds of ways of understanding things. But again, focusing on the data on this, right? Let me point something out to you. Regardless of your age, when you get over here to 2019, look at how much this, you can see this, the trend. And this is trend data. Now, and what I said about if something is a trend or a fad, that's different than what I'm talking about now. Here, looking at data to discern trends is really important for us to be able to make predictions about the future. So the trend here is growth in internet use over time. So much so that regardless of your age, you're almost 75% or above, regardless of your age. As a matter of fact, for younger people, those 18 to 29, what percent of them use the internet? Almost all of them do. So it's not just you that uses the internet, it's everybody your age, regardless of your age, almost, even if you're 65 and older. So that also signifies a major cultural shift. It's not just one age group that's doing it, everybody's doing it. Okay? That's a really important point to note. That's what it gives you indication, something that is large scale impact. Look at this in terms of the percent who use the internet by income. So here we got people that make less than $30,000. Here we got people that make $30,000 to $49,000 and $50,000 to $74,000 and then $75,000 and up. Okay, actually, it looks like that's right. So the $30,000 is here. The next one is here. This one is here, and then 75,000 up is this group. Now look back in 2000. Poor people, and that's what this indicates, poor people, adults, 34% were using the internet, and look at for rich people, 81%. If you go back 20 years, getting access to the internet was a little bit more expensive than it is now, generally speaking for everybody. Now, I can also say people realize that you need to have access to the internet, so that becomes a primary expense. People will spend the money on having access to the internet for a variety of reasons, right? There's an interesting change in that regard that I'll show you here in a few minutes. Some new, more recent data shows something a little bit different about that. Now here's what I want to show you. So this went from 34%, we're just going to focus on the lower end of the income spectrum here and the higher end here. So it went from 34% in the year 2000 down to 82% here in 2019. That's a huge increase, right? And there's increases all across the board here. For wealthy people, they were already extremely high, but it went to 96%. Now, looking across the board here, regardless of how much money you make, you're 80% and up about internet use. Those that are just above the lower income range here that want the first tier above the 30,000, look, that's 93%. So regardless of your age, regardless of your income, you're likely to use the internet. So again, a really important part of society. And this is just in 25 years, right? So look over here in terms of this is actually looking at broadband users by education level. Now look here in 2000, we didn't even have broadband. So that's why it's so low. your parents probably remember a time when there was a dial-up connection, when they plugged into the wall and it sounded like a fax machine when you dialed up for the internet access, and that's how you had internet access. Internet speeds were extremely slow. Of course, the internet back then was not much to it. It was pretty lame compared to what it is now. You know, much different. The technology has come so far in 20 years, right? And then you look at broadband use over time. Again, this is about education level. And again, pretty similar right here. But people with less education, that's what this line is, less than a high school graduate. And then this here is a college graduate. Why is it that college graduates are more likely to use broadband? Well, you might have to have it in order to do school, you know, not just during COVID, but even before this, you have to usually use a computer and get access to the internet in some form or fashion. So, you know, the internet is good for lots of things, not just education, but maybe your work, maybe for entertainment, maybe for knowledge, maybe for a number of things, right? Because more and more, you can't get things done without having access to the internet. And that's a big issue because some people don't have enough money to have access, and older generations are less likely to have access to it, and so they kind of miss out on some things sometimes. This has been an issue with people getting vaccines for the COVID, because the older age groups are less likely to use the internet. Well, how do you know? Turn on the TV. You know, you certainly have more information you can access on the internet than you can by picking it up on a television. And that's an interesting statement to make because it used to not be that way. You used to get information exclusively from newspapers, the radio, and television. And the internet, for all intents and purposes, has replaced all that in 20 years, 25 years. Okay? Moving on to the next slide here. This is broadband users by age. Okay, a while ago we looked at education. This is now by age. Here are the 65 plus, so just over 50% in 2019. That's the most recent data that we have. Here, these are above 75%. Now, this is broadband users. So broadband means a high-speed internet connection. Okay, so they may have access to the internet, but maybe not through broadband. Maybe it's through a slower internet provider, especially maybe a rural area. Rural areas are less likely to have broadband access. Okay, next slide here. Now we're looking at social media, okay? Social media and social networking. So we're talking about using the internet, and then the next step here we're going to talk about is social media and social networking. So the percent of the U.S. adults who use at least one social media site, okay? So in 2005, look at this, and look at how this has changed. It's remarkable. It's absolutely extraordinary how much these things have affected people and affected society. Percent of the U.S. adults who use at least one social media site by age. So if you're 18 to 29, again, this one here, more likely to use it than if you are 65 and up. You can see the age groups here. Really interesting data. And again, the point is that regardless if you're looking at, have you noticed this, by the way? We've been looking at this in terms of income, in terms of, if you look at here, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of education, and the same thing that there are a little bit of differences, you know, between groups, but look at the trend in all of these. It's all up in every single one of these. So regardless of your gender, regardless of your race, regardless of your income, regardless of your educational level, this is why I can say, I feel really confident in saying that this is a cultural revolution. It's not just young people. It's not just a certain category of people, whatever category you want to look at. Every category is showing the same thing. Now, we're going to look at some data later in the semester about how race matters in terms of occupation, or how gender matters in terms of income. there are some things about the positions that we hold in society and how culture sees those positions relative to access to resources or relative to privilege or not. And so, yes, these things matter in society. Your race, your education, where you live, your gender, your sexual preference sometimes matters in society. So these are the ways that we study humans. These are the ways that we study culture and how we study society as well. Okay. Okay. So moving forward here, percent of the U.S. adults. Now we're looking at specific applications, and you might find this interesting. I'll point out a few things because the lines start to blur a little bit. But this top line here is YouTube. Okay, and then this is Facebook, and then this is everything else lumped together. Twitter, Reddit, LinkedIn, Instagram, WhatsApp, Pinterest, and Snapchat. So these are generally pretty low use in terms of adults. Now, if you start looking at this by age group, you see something different. I think the next slide does have some things by age group, right? Now, this is a little bit difficult to understand and read this, so let me point out a little bit of this. So Snapchat and Instagram are especially popular among 18 to 24-year-olds, right? So the percent of U.S. adults in each age group who say they ever use in Snapchat, you can see only 3% of those 65 and up use Snapchat, all right? And then look at this, 18 to 24-year-olds, 73%. So that's exactly what we're talking about. You're looking at adults, this goes back to that slide we had a moment ago, adults that as an entire category are less likely to use these services here, but once you start looking at this more closely in terms of age group, you see something very different, right? Young people are more likely to use all of these, really. They're more likely to use Snapchat, they're more likely to use Instagram, more likely to use Twitter, much more likely to use YouTube, although, well, I'll say much more likely compared to younger people, to older people. But also, this is, you see 25 to 29-year-olds are higher than 18 to 24-year-olds, right? And you see something here too, that older people are more likely than 18 to 24-year-olds to use Facebook. You probably knew that. And this is also why you're less likely to use Facebook if you are, even if you're 16 to 24, because you don't want to go where your parents are, right? Adults are not as much fun as young people are. Well, that's actually not entirely true, but maybe young people think that, okay? You see what I'm getting at. So some interesting variation according to age in terms of which apps that people use, okay? But again, you know, there's still a very high number of people that are using the internet, regardless of your age, race, gender, education, income, very large number of people that are using a cell phone or a smartphone. Look at this, we didn't start looking at smartphones until 2011, 2012. And you can see here that this number is above 75%. Any cell phone, look, that's almost 100%. Now this is U.S. adults. Now, we can ask the question, what about those that are 17 years of age and younger? And I know that some people that are watching this video are 17 years of age and maybe even down to 16. Do you have a smartphone? So it's not just adults. Do any of you have younger brothers and sisters that use cell phones? They may not use them to call on the phone, but they may use them for TikTok, for Discord, for streaming YouTube, for Crunchyroll. I'm thinking about the things that my son uses, and he's 13 years old, right? So you can only assume that if all adults are using, then probably some younger people are too. I mean, younger people see people using cell phones, so they want one too, right? You know, this goes back to the impact of the primary people that we associate with, significant others. And when we see society at large using that, you know, young people pick up on that, right? So some information here just to kind of, I'll let you pause this if you want to look at some of this, but what do people use smartphones for? Now, this is a little bit older. This goes back to 2014. But you get an idea that smartphones aren't just for talking on the phone, as you all know that, right? So it's not just you that knows that smartphones can be used for something more than talking on the phone. This is what people use them for. And you can see over here, again, how this varies according to age. Again, this is 2014, it's a little bit older, but it, again, give you an idea about what people use their smartphones for. More and more, it's people's primary camera. It's their video camera as well, right? And notice it talks about video and video calls here. This is a little bit older too, but I want to point out something about this, okay? Despite the clear benefits, 54% of smartphone owners, and this is probably higher now, but 54% of smartphone owners say their phone is not always needed, but 46% say it is something they couldn't live without. I always like to ask my students the question, do you sleep with your cell phone? And I don't mean do you have it in bed with you, but I know that some people, with their boyfriends and girlfriends, they go to bed on the phone kind of a thing. But do you have your phone right next to you when you go to sleep? And, that says something about you and us, right? No, it's not always needed, but, I can't live without it. So this is interesting how people wrestle with this. And when I have discussions with students about this, they say, I could put it down and that sort of thing. Well, then put it down. Why don't you put it down? Because you can't live without it. Because you need, so we've created an identity, right? The way we interact with our smartphones and interact with people through our smartphones, we've created an identity of sorts related to our smartphones. What kind of impact does that have on who we are? And many of you are going to have an assignment based on this going forward about your social interactions. So a lot of what we've talked about in chapter 4 was around social interaction in everyday life. Well, interaction doesn't just have to be in the physical world. To what extent does our interaction in the virtual world affect our identity and help define our identity? And that's something that we haven't been thinking too much about in the last 15 years. We haven't been thinking too much about the repercussions, the pros and the cons of using smartphones to interact with people we know, people we don't know. But that, serves to define the self. That's part of the social experience. In some cases, that's a lot of people's social experience, the experience of life through a cell phone. Right? Well, how does that impact the development of the self? I mentioned a few minutes ago about using broadband and using the internet. Check this out. Americans of all ages are increasingly likely to say they mostly go online using their smartphone. So we're actually seeing a little bit of drop in the number of adults that have internet access at home because they're able to access the internet through a hotspot, maybe, but through their mobile phone. I mean, these mobile phones, in some cases, are better than computers. They're faster, they're quicker. They can access the internet without an internet service if you have cell service, right? And so there has been thinking that moving forward, we would see less internet providers and more cell providers to provide data for accessing the internet. You got to think your cell phone, making a phone call is just part of it. It's mainly using the internet, whether it's through social media, social networking, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, Amazon, whatever, right? So these aren't phones as much as they are miniature computers. And, the data is pretty clear on this. And this is looking at since 2013. A lot of the data I've showed you has been since 2000. This is looking at just over the last 6 years, 7 years, right? Look at the shift in usage of going online with your smartphone in the last 6 or 7 years. Look at that. It's remarkable of how much society can change, how quickly it can change. Teens hold mixed opinions about whether they spend too much time in front of their screens. So the percent of U.S. teens, this is those 15 to, or 13 to 17, the percent of U.S. teens who say they spend blank on the following. If they spend too much time, about the right time. Teens are even saying that they spend too much time on their cell phone. And yet they fight with parents when parents say something to them about it. Maybe not. They understand they're spending too much time. What is it that they understand? Is it making them tired? So humans are, regardless of age, have an intuition, don't they? Interesting. They spend too much time on social media, playing video games, but half or more have cut back on the time that they spend using these technologies. So the percent of U.S. teens who say they ever cut back on the amount of time that they spend on their cell phone, social media, playing video games. So over half of U.S. teens, and this is 2018, indicate that they've cut back on their use of these. Now maybe parents are, providing pressure on that. Maybe schools are providing pressure on that. But teens have recognized the need to kind of cut back on some things. Okay? All right. So hopefully you found that interesting, right? This digital dualism. So over the last 20 years, we've been using the internet more, not just adults, but young people too. Not just using the internet, but more and more using smartphones. And not using them to talk on the phone, but using them for a lot of other things too, social media and social networking. So this is why you've had some assignments around this, because it's a fundamental part of how we live and who we are. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and stick around for the next lecture coming up soon enough, and let me know if you have any questions.